You all for coming. So we are here to talk about legal action for divestment. My name is Martha Denton. I'm an organizer with Fossil Fuel Divest Harvard. I am a freshman at Harvard, and I have been working on the very, very big project of filing a complaint with the Massachusetts Attorney General, along with other folks in the campaign. And I will pass it to Kyle to introduce himself.
Thanks, Martha. Hi, everyone. My name is Kyle Rosenthal. I'm a senior at Boston College with the group Climate Justice at BC, and I'm also a coordinator of the Catholic Divestment Network. I've been involved with filing a complaint with the Mass Attorney General as well against Boston College, and I'll pass to Alana.
Hi, I'm Alana, she, hers. I am an organizer with Fossil Fuel Divest Harvard and was involved with filing our complaint.
Yeah, so just a quick overview of the talk today, or I guess event. We're going to start with kind of the basics of filing a complaint and lawsuits and what legal action looks like. And then we're going to walk through kind of a timeline of the actions that have happened so far, and what different lawsuits and complaints have happened over the past few decades. And then we'll end with some suggestions for research and resources and like how to actually go about doing this. And then at the end, we're hoping to have 15 to 20 minutes for some Q&A. So if this is something that your university is interested in doing, or if this is something that you just would like to know more about, make sure to think of some questions, and we'll make sure to have a good chunk of time at the end to address those. Okay. Alana, Kyle, anything else to add before kick it off? Cool. All right, so we're actually going to start with the video that Fossil Fuel Divest Harvard launched when we filed our complaint just this March. And this is specifically Fossil Fuel Divest Harvard, but many of the signatories and the arguments are similar to the complaint that Boston College actually filed last December. Here we go.
We're in a climate crisis, and the fossil fuel industry wants to keep it that way.
We are students,
alumni,
economists,
scientists, faculty,
union members,
community members,
elected officials,
joining together to call on Harvard University,
one of the world's richest and most powerful institutions of higher education,
to divest its nearly $42 billion endowment from the fossil fuel industry and to reinvest in a just and stable future.
For nearly a decade, we've rallied, marched, organized, spoken out, and even stormed a football field. And now we're filing a complaint with the Office of Massachusetts Attorney General Maura Healey to pressure Harvard to divest.
The law is clear. Harvard is violating its legal obligations as a charitable institution by continuing to invest in an industry that puts the futures of its students and everyone else at risk.
I'm talking to you about the climate emergency, the planet's being poisoned.
Young people's futures are being destroyed.
And the most vulnerable communities are disproportionately being hit and targeted.
We know that to preserve hope of a just and stable future, we need to dramatically scale down carbon emissions, shifting away from fossil fuels as quickly as possible.
But unless something changes, oil companies' continued commitment to their deadly business model will prevent nations from reaching their Paris Agreement goals.
Instead, these companies are lobbying against bold climate policy, buying off elected officials, spreading misinformation, and attacking climate scientists, including Harvard's own, year after year after year.
And as the planet burns, Harvard is standing with the arsonists.
Divestment is the idea that if it's wrong to wreck the planet, It's wrong to invest in that destruction.
And divestment works. Just ask leading scientists, investors, economists, or fossil fuel companies themselves.
By divesting its endowment and taking a clear stand against the companies driving the climate crisis, Harvard could send a signal to the world that an economy predicated on the extraction and exploitation of our environment and communities is unjustifiable.
This complaint is only the beginning.
So long as fossil fuel companies continue to jeopardize people on the planet and our most powerful institutions aid and abet them, we'll be here fighting back. And we need you fighting with us.
So join us
in fighting to put companies that refuse to embrace a just transition out of business.
Join us in fighting to put Harvard and all of its peer institutions on the right side of history.
Join us in fighting for our planet, our communities, and our future.
It's time to divest. Now.
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 All right. So for those of you who trickled in a bit later, we are talking about the legal argument for divestment, and we just watched a video that we published when Fossil Fuel Divest Harvard filed our legal complaint with the Massachusetts Attorney General, which is very similar to one filed by the folks at Boston College. And we had a guest appearance in that video from our very own Alana Cohen. So I'm going to pass it off to Alana to talk about reasons for divestment.
Cool. Thank you, Martha. Yeah, so just to start off our talk today, I thought it'd be good to go through, why do we care about divestment in the first place? I'm sure a lot of folks are already familiar with this on the call, but I think it's also helpful to think about these reasons in the context of how we can convey them to, say, relevant legal authorities when we're filing complaints, which is what we're going to be talking about today. So first, there's the moral imperative. That's sort of the most intuitive one, right? Like, especially for universities or what we're dealing with here, which is more largely nonprofit and charitable institutions. All of those institutions have missions and responsibilities to community members or constituencies that they're meant to be protecting and safeguarding the futures of. There's a very clear hypocrisy in simultaneously espousing a commitment to protecting certain community and their futures, and then actively investing in an industry that is destroying those futures every day, that is crippling the planet, and that is really harming the most vulnerable communities among us. So the moral imperative to divest is pretty clear, and it's what most people are familiar with. The financial imperative to divest is what I think has actually changed the most in the last decade since the fossil fuel divestment movement first began. Fossil fuels have never been a great investment because inevitably, if we are going to take climate action, it means our society has to decarbonize and move away from fossil fuels. So, right, there's a clear financial risk there if you're putting your money into assets that we just can't use. Like, we can't keep burning more fossil fuels, can't keep extracting and producing them if we're actually going to transition to a clean energy economy that can support our communities, our planet, and our futures. But the financial risk of investing in fossil fuels has become very, very palpable. Actually, I think a lot more quickly than folks have expected, in large part because of the success of the divestment movement to date. There's a very, very clear material risk that comes with investing in fossil fuels. Lots of studies like the mythical peril of divesting from Jeremy Grantham have shown that there's no net financial loss from divestment. In many cases, there's actually a financial gain from not putting money into these really risky assets, and also from actively investing in socially responsible green industries. And then most recently, actually, if folks haven't seen it yet, Bill McKibben has like a great New Yorker piece on it called The Powerful New Financial Argument for Divestment, or something along those lines. BlackRock released internal reports that shows that this asset manager, which is the largest in the world, recognizes the financial case for divestment, basically saying that divestment is not going to cause financial losses. Why BlackRock still hasn't recommended divesting to the folks under its own auspices is a different question, but the fact that the world's largest asset manager and one of the most intransigent actors on climate, says that divestment makes financial sense, is a really, really big, powerful deal. Next slide. Okay, and finally, the third reason to divest, in addition to the moral and financial imperative, this is what we're going to be focusing on today. There's actually a legal imperative for many institutions to divest. The institutions we're going to be talking about, which I already alluded to, are specifically nonprofit institutions, which include institutions of higher education, like our universities. All of those institutions are actually bound by a law called the Uniform Prudent Management of Institutional Funds Act. That act exists in every single state except for Pennsylvania, and it's also not in Puerto Rico. But so in the vast majority of the United States, there is a piece of legislation that basically says nonprofit institutions have to manage their assets and their endowments in accordance with their charitable missions. That means they have to invest in ways that are financially responsible and that are effectively morally responsible, right? Ways that actually speak to the interests of their constituents and to their missions of serving said constituents. So investments in fossil fuels pretty obviously contravene those duties for most universities, which have missions of educating students and preparing them for futures that are actively being destroyed by the fossil fuel industry, right? This continued pattern of investment is just totally bizarre. In addition to not being financially prudent, the financial risk of investing in fossil fuels, again, is very, very clear. And so on both of those fronts, we can sort of see that university fund managers are really not acting in good faith by knowingly putting their money into fossil fuel companies. As it says in bold, like a prudent investor would basically do otherwise. They would divest. And so this is the basis for the complaints that we're going to be talking about today, and the ones filed by Harvard, Boston College, and actually some other schools as well around the country, is this idea that our universities are actually breaching their legal duties as well as any financial and moral obligations we think they might have by failing to divest. Cool. So we also want to make clear that in today's talk, we are not going to be focusing on lawsuits. Lawsuits are a totally valid tactic, and as you'll hear shortly, they're one that have been used by the divestment movement in the past and actually are still used by the divestment movement on an ongoing basis. But what we're going to be talking about are complaints. And I think the word complaint can sound really ambiguous. Not a lot of folks are familiar off the bat with complaints as opposed to lawsuits, which involve bringing someone to court and seem a lot more showy on the face. But complaints can be super effective. And there's actually a lot of benefits that are entailed in not filing a lawsuit on this front, because a complaint does not involve any litigation, right? So when you file a complaint, what you're basically doing is putting a legal document, a well-reasoned legal document, before a relevant legal authority saying, hi, X, it's your job to enforce this law, and I'm showing you that one of the people who falls under this law, say Harvard University or Boston College, is failing to comply with it. So now you, X, which is in this case the Attorney General, need to do your job and investigate them, and then ultimately, assuming our reasoning is correct, you need to compel said university to comply with this law, which means divesting. So complaints are that. They're twofold. They're one, a request for action from the relevant legal authorities, and two, just sort of an ask for oversight, right? Attorneys general, which is who we're focused on and who we've been filing these complaints with, they actually have a job of holding nonprofit institutions accountable and making sure that they're acting in ways that comply with their missions and the relevant legislation around them. So Attorney General Maura Healey, it's her job to oversee all the universities in Massachusetts state and making sure that they actually invest in ways that align with the Uniform Prudent Management of Institutional Funds Act. So we're asking her to do her job is effectively what this complaint is doing. I think it's also important to note complaints can lead to lawsuits and litigation, but they're not ones that would involve the person who filed the complaint. So for example, if Attorney General Healey decides to actually pick up the complaint that Fossil Fuel Divest Harvard or students at Boston College put forward, the students are not going to be all of a sudden caught up in a legal battle with their universities. And that's pretty advantageous to you, the student, right? Because it's a lot to be a party to a lawsuit. And obviously there are clear risks of retribution, which, to be clear, complaints can also induce retribution. But there's some greater degree of separation in knowing that like an actual very powerful legal authority is the person who would be suing your university, right? If the attorney general determines that they're not complying with the law based on your complaint and she wants to act on it and your university refuses, like that's when a lawsuit would actually emerge. So that threat of like continued litigation is there with a complaint, which is also what makes them very, very powerful, because universities definitely don't want to be caught up in lawsuits anytime, but they especially don't want to be caught up in lawsuits against like state attorneys general. That's a lot more intimidating, and from a public angle looks a lot worse than being caught up per se in a lawsuit with a student. It very clearly insinuates that they're breaking the law. Move on to the next slide. Cool. Okay. I also just want to clarify that these complaints come against a broader political landscape of the climate and environmental movement using the legal world and litigation as tactics for advancing a just transition. So Juliana versus the United States is probably the most prominent example of that case brought against the federal government that I think was, Kyle knows more, was relaunched like 2 days ago with some new strategy involved. But the gist of it is like young people trying to hold the government accountable for failing to act on climate change. In a more direct parallel to the complaints that we filed very recently, 3 major environmental/public accountability groups filed a complaint against Chevron with the Federal Trade Commission, right? So they went to the relevant legal authority, they filed a comprehensive legal document arguing that Chevron is violating the relevant laws and regulations under this body through greenwashing and its advertisements and marketing campaigns. We're basically doing the same thing with our university, saying that going to the relevant party and saying like they're not complying with the things that they're supposed to be doing and they're pretending like they are. Here's the reason why, and now we want you to act to make them do what they're supposed to be doing in the first place.
Great, thanks, Alana. So yeah, now we're going to look a little bit more closely at sort of how this developed within the larger divestment movement, both with fossil fuel divestment and larger than that. So back in 2014, the fossil fuel divestment movement started before then, but at the first major milestone of tracking commitments to divest, about $52 billion was divested from fossil fuels by about 181 institutions, and that included universities, the Rockefeller Brothers Foundation, governments, pension funds, a really wide assortment of institutions, as well as churches and other religious organizations as well, which obviously at the time was a very substantial amount. And so with that basis, students had been campaigning at Harvard, Boston College, really over 100 universities, not just in the U.S. but internationally, for the university to divest from fossil fuels. Again, in addition to other institutions as well. And Harvard and Boston College, claiming to be leading academic institutions, world-class institutions. It really seemed that to students and alumni and faculty at the time that they should be at the forefront of this movement. And we'll look a little bit more closely in a minute at why and what kind of basis and precedent there was for that. But so having attempted to engage in dialogue at both of our universities on that, it really kind of fell flat, and a lot of different tactics were tried. Ultimately, culminating in 2014 with some students in the law school and some others filing a lawsuit against Harvard over its fossil fuel investments. And as Alana said, obviously right now we're focusing on complaints, but that's really because there was this initial lawsuit. And Martha will also jump into this later, but the students who filed that initial lawsuit went on to found their own firm that is actively helping with this complaint process and just litigation strategy generally in the divestment movement. But so from 2014 to about 2016, that lawsuit was tied up in courts and appeals, and ultimately was thrown out for standing, which was just the fact that it was argued by the courts in Massachusetts at the time that students were not essentially able to sue universities or really any nonprofit over their investments. It didn't argue that the investments were right or wrong or really anything with actual substance to them. It just said students aren't able to bring this into a court of law, which was frustrating, but also at the same time, again, didn't give kind of a substantial answer, which again leads to the complaint process. So fast forward a little bit, at this point in around 2019, the divestment movement has really ballooned and exploded, and there's well over 100 universities at that point that have divested everything from the entire University of Massachusetts system, to the country of Ireland ultimately divesting its federal pension system from fossil fuels, among other things. And so again, with the knowledge of that initial Harvard lawsuit, there was again a pivot in legal strategy for schools that again, were supposed to be these leading institutions and weren't even engaging in dialogue at the time. So again, November 2019, some students at Cornell filed a complaint with the New York Attorney General over fossil fuel investments, and that was the first specific complaint against the university over its fossil fuel investments to a state attorney general. Uh, as Alana said, usually these are, and the Cornell one was as well, researched documents that give specific details to the laws being broken and other things that the attorney general should look into. And the Cornell one was initially just kind of a 2-page outline of what that looked like. And they filed it with the attorney general and continued other aspects of their divestment campaign. And before the attorney general actually took any action, the office received it, didn't take any specific action other than general investigation, and Cornell ultimately decided to divest in May of 2020 fully from fossil fuels, which was a big win for that campaign, and just goes to show that again, even the threat of this complaint and carrying out that action was successful in that case, because clearly the university didn't want to be tied up or really look like it was in any type of engagement with the attorney general, because again, that implies and as we know, shows that they are breaking the law. And so just another kind of pinpoint moment was in February 2020. In addition to pushing universities to divest from fossil fuels, there are a number of other major divestment movements, including a push to divest from private prisons. And so there's a campaign at Harvard that I know is tied closely to the fossil fuel divestment campaign. They ultimately decided to launch a lawsuit as well in February of 2020. And as far as I know, that's still ongoing with appeals as well. And again, versus a complaint that still has some major issues with standing, not necessarily the substance of what they're talking about. And so bringing us forward to November and December of 2020, at this point, again, we look back to 2014, $52 billion at the time had been divested. As it stands, as of April 1st of this year, 2021, $14.56 trillion with the T has been divested by more than 1,300 institutions. And that's formal public commitments. There have been a lot of quieter ones as well. And that's everything from the country of Ireland and Norway to the state and city of New York. And again, hundreds and hundreds of universities in the United States, Canada, UK, Australia, and really around the world that have taken that action. So again, with the same knowledge that there was in 2014, that the Harvard, BCs, Cornells, and other schools of the world that, again, claim to be world leaders should be leading this push for fossil fuel divestment, that really led to the complaints that we filed against BC in December of 2020 and Harvard just last month in March. And again, those are with the Massachusetts State Attorney General currently, and that process is still ongoing. So if we go to the next slide, we can kind of zoom out a little bit just for the divestment movement generally. And so really the first push to divest universities from anything, and the first time that word was really put around was in the 1980s. And that was a push to divest from companies that were engaging in apartheid in South Africa. And Archbishop Desmond Tutu was really a founder of that movement and is still very involved and active in pushing for fossil fuel divestment from universities. And again, looking back to the 1980s, universities didn't have nearly the size endowments that they do today. And a lot of their ownership was directly in companies versus mutual funds and other things that claim to tie them up. And again, Martha will talk about some other resources with looking at the modern day endowment and investments and what those look like. But it was very easy and clear to see, what companies they were invested in. But I think what's really important is all the divestment movements up into and including the one today involve racial justice and climate justice and all of those things kind of tied up into one, and fossil fuels to a certain extent. And it's really just important to note that, again, they're all kind of rooted in the same things and the same structural issues. And another thing to note, that divestment from apartheid in South Africa in the 80s, Harvard and Boston College both did divest. They were pretty behind in that movement, and the action, was still important and did push for changes. But again, recognizing that, it's clear to see, how that relates to their really, lack of action today. There was also a big push in the 1990s and early 2000s to divest from tobacco companies. And again, that push really was catalyzed by large-scale litigation by cities, states, and countries against the big tobacco companies. And again, we're seeing that today. So, as Lana mentioned, our complaints are to the Massachusetts Attorney General, who is currently engaged in a lawsuit against ExxonMobil and other fossil fuel companies. The New York Attorney General is also engaged in some lawsuits around that, as well as, again, a number of other cities, states, and countries. And so, again, there was this big push by governments to sue the tobacco companies, and they were successful. And that really spurred a lot of universities to realize that, they're actively causing moral harm, but also, financial harm, and they aren't quality investments when they're actively being sued by so many different, government authorities. And in addition to those lawsuits being further regulated, again, looking to fossil fuels today, we're seeing that exact same thing with lawsuits and, massively increased regulation that, in addition to all of the moral reasons, are really just another, financial reason to divest. I mean, again, there's a number of other divestment movements that have happened and are currently ongoing, including from the Sudan in 2006, and that did involve a lot of fossil fuel companies that were involved in active extraction and exploitation activities. But again, the first real fossil fuel divestment focusing entirely on that industry campaign happened in about 2011 at Swarthmore College, and that's the same year that my group Climate Justice at BC was founded. So again, been more than a decade that students have been doing that. So again, it's a very long movement that is ongoing, and there's a lot of different things at play that look to the past and apply to the current movement, and just are more reasons for our institutions to take some type of action. And with that, I'll pass it back to Martha.
Well, I think I'm doing this part, but I'm just gonna be aware of the time, and we're gonna try to go a little more quickly so that we can have time for Q&A. But yeah, thank you for that, Kyle. So in terms of why file a complaint now, I think that, to be clear, this isn't an argument that divestment is necessarily going to be won because we compel it legally. But there is a very sound legal argument behind these complaints. I put some more context for where the specific legal strategy we're invoking at BC and Harvard comes from in the chat. But really, this is another way to drum up public pressure, right? Assuming that divestment is going to happen largely because we are making it unaffordable for institutions to perpetuate the status quo, generating serious headlines around, the potential for litigation and or actually seeing litigation is a great way to do that. Also, the complaints give you a really unique opportunity as a divestment campaign to lay out totally comprehensively why your institution is doing the wrong thing by failing to divest. You can lay out the moral, financial, and legal case in a way that is very specific to your institution. Okay. Yeah, I think I kind of got this. I guess one more thing that's important to note is that because the statute that we're invoking here is essentially national, any one of these complaints, when I say anyone, I mean the complaints that have been filed, but also if you guys file complaints, being picked up by an attorney general and acted on could set a precedent for, institutional investing by nonprofits in a way that is aligned with the just transition across the entire country. And that would be pretty damn incredible. So the more complaints of this kind that get filed, that get attention, that drum up public pressure, the more likely we are to actually see movement in that front. Whether it's because, this legal mandate is recognized and it's therefore enforced by attorneys general, or because this just becomes such a prominent and mainstream argument that institutions start moving a lot faster to divest at a time when the imperative to do so is already clearly so strong. Yeah, and then lastly, this is just a way to really keep up our movement's momentum, especially during the pandemic, and to really make sure that students have the chance to shape the public narrative of what divestment is about. I'm gonna hand it off to Mark.
Awesome. Yeah, sorry, I moved the slides a bit quickly. Yeah, so I'm going to walk through some thoughts and resources for taking action, and I'm going to try to do it sort of briefly so we can get some questions, but we'll share the link to this so that you can kind of go back if this is a tactic you end up pursuing. So here's kind of a list of general steps. This isn't a super linear process, so it's just kind of some guiding points. So like Alana mentioned before, it's important to discuss if this is the right tactic for your campaign. Yeah, just depending on your campaign's sort of strategy and the factors like your state laws and the university that you attend, it could be right or wrong. It's kind of up to you. So then I think an important thing is to research and like really understand. So this is kind of like combined with the first step. So in order to like kind of get a better understanding of that, it's important to research all of these factors and make sure to consult the different stakeholders in your campaign, like faculty, alumni, community members, whoever you typically organize with. And then there will be some resources on a later slide for legal help with this. And then there's a process of drafting and editing the complaint and really solidifying your arguments. And then finally, for both of our for both of our complaints, we had lists of signatories, which I will also get to in a later slide. And those are just all the people who are kind of putting their name on it, like, yes, I support this. The Attorney General should look into this. And then you file, which is very exciting. All right, so as for research, here are a few different areas that you could consider looking into and building an argument off of. So as Alana mentioned, UPMIFA is, there's a version of it in 49 states, so it's very likely that your state also has something like this, but here are some other suggestions. You can also look through the Harvard complaint and the BC complaint for ideas for language and structure. You're like more than welcome to lift things directly from there. The Harvard complaint would not have been possible without the hard work of the BC folks. So this is something we really want to like kind of help everyone do if that's something you choose to do, because like Alana said, the more complaints, the more this becomes like the institutional norm. So yeah, here are just a few things. And as I said, I'll send this out so that everyone can look at this list more closely. And then, like I said, there are signatories that you can have at the end of your complaint, such as elected officials, climate scientists, alumni, community members, faculty, community orgs. And here are just some tips for how to go about that outreach. But if this is something you'd like to pursue, don't don't feel like you need to understand all of this now. We and also the resources like the Climate Defense Project that I'll get to later are always here to help and can help with kind of these details. And here they are. So as Kyle mentioned before, both of our campaigns actually worked with the Climate Defense Project, which is a group of 3 attorneys who actually filed the original Harvard lawsuit, which was unsuccessful, but now they founded this and have just done so many wonderful things for the divestment movement. So here's their like general email and then a website with some more information about what they do. But it's pro bono. They're very friendly. It's really wonderful to work with them. So I think that's definitely a main resource. If you need help with research, Little Sis is a really great place to start. There's an article about researching your university's fossil fuel investments. And then here's some information about UPMIFA. And the like specific bills that or like specific laws in each state that deal with this issue, and then links to the full complaint, and then our email addresses here. All right, so with that, I am going to stop screen sharing, and I would love to field any and all questions about like the mechanics, the justification, like really anything about legal action. So I'm not sure exactly the format, Melissa, if you want to field anything, but we are happy to talk.
And one thing I did just want to add in that we didn't mention, but as Martha was saying right at the end there, there's really, a whole host of signatories you could have, from alumni to faculty, politicians, experts. Our complaint at Boston College, our student group, Climate Justice at BC, was very, very involved with it and organizing it and doing press. We ultimately did not have any students as signatories to the complaint itself. As Alana was saying, retribution is definitely something that is a relevant factor, and that also helped keep us just distanced enough to be able to focus on other active organizing and dialogue work that we were attempting at the same time and are still involved in. And again, we are very involved and open about our involvement with the complaint, but that is another route to really have, again, alumni and people who are able to kind of take just the burden of that process and engagement. And again, that is a route, but it's not the only one by any means.
Any questions?
I see one in the chat.
No, Kyle, correct me if I'm wrong, but no, there is not, at least in Massachusetts. Yeah, they can take as long as they want, and I don't even think that Mara Healy, for example, has like formally responded to either. I will say Falsify Divest Harvard is meeting with the AG's office in a week, so that's super exciting. But
Yeah, as far as I know, there's no obligation in terms of a timeline, at least in Massachusetts. Other states definitely might have that, and that's something to evaluate. I know on the federal government side, with like the complaint to the FTC, there is like a certain number of days that they legally have to respond, which is, you know, a pretty good thing to have. And yeah, it's just, I think for us about constant engagement, and there's a lot of factors, whether it's, you know, Maura Healey may be running for another office, and that's, you know, kind of an opportunity for us to put pressure on. And again, there's a lot of different things that could be at play to ensure that there is some type of formal response. But again, the more detailed you make it and the more research you have in there, the easier it is to, you know, make sure that it is responded to in some way.
yeah, I also think, yeah, I'll just say, I think it's very possible there are probably legal like timeframes within which technically like officials are supposed to respond. But like there is a lot of backlog right now with consumer complaints, understandably. Any other questions? It can be specific if you guys are thinking about doing this with your own schools and have questions. Actually, that's like what we would really love to help with, is deciding like if this is something you want to do, and then what it would look like if you do want to do it.
Go for it.
Hello, yes, can you hear me? Hi, yes, so, you know, I'm a student at Pitzer College. And, you know, Pitzer, it's a private, you know, small liberal arts college, you know, much smaller than Harvard University. And, you know, Pitzer divested from fossil fuels, you know, a long time ago, you know, in 2014, you know, it was one of the first few colleges to do so. And what Pitzer did, you know, after they divested was, you know, they worked with the investment manager BlackRock to create an ESG screened fund that Pitzer uses. And, you know, later on, they also adopted, you know, the vice chairman of BlackRock onto the board of trustees at Pitzer. And so, you know, if you don't know much about Pitzer, its core values are of social responsibility and environmental sustainability. And, you know, I think there's something to be said about how Pitzer's marketing of their core values conflicts with the flagrant greenwashing that they do at Pitzer in terms of protecting the trustee from criticism, and also in terms of using financial products from BlackRock, you know, that potentially include, you know, corporations in the prison industrial complex, you know, corporations involved with the occupation, you know, in Palestine. And, you know, I wonder if, you know, we made these demands for his removal and the divestment, you know, over a year ago, you know, in October of 2019. And so I wonder, you know, at what point has this escalated to the point that we need to file a complaint?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think a good thing to note is that this strategy under MIFA is like really not climate specific. Like the reason in part it's been used by climate is just one, fossil divestment campaigns have picked it up, but two, the actual original person who like came up with the legal strategy that our complaints are based on, Beavis Longstreth, is someone who cares a lot about climate related risk. But it is like generally a statute that can be used to hold nonprofit institutions for account for any sort of non-prudent like investment that fails to align with their missions as nonprofit institutions and their duties as nonprofit asset managers. So I think it would be well worth looking into whether or not, and it could be very cool to see like a complaint about, divestment from prisons and other industries that uses this same statute. And I think you could probably invoke a lot of the same structure of our complaints, although the material would be very different in terms of like whether or not it's worth it. I think that's like an individual, like, campaign calculus. The benefit of things like complaints, as like Kyle really shows, is like anyone can launch them. It doesn't even have to be like your divestment campaign per se. Like anyone could just file a complaint with your attorney general anytime because you think someone's violating the law. That's like why we have attorneys general who are meant to respond to these sorts of things. But definitely like it is a really good way to one, lay out a comprehensive argument, right? Like to put your reasoning first and foremost out there for your university, and two, to like shape a public narrative that is in your favor, even if it doesn't lead to legal action. It can very easily drum up public pressure. I mean, one, because you can use it to attract press, but two, because like then you actually have something pending with an attorney general, which is like not what any college or university of any size ever wants to hear.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, again, I think even the threat of a complaint can definitely drive that dialogue or action. And I personally think that this absolutely applies to private prisons and a number of the other movements that you mentioned, in addition to fossil fuels. Just as another note, we ultimately didn't go this route. We did mention, like Boston College is a Catholic university, and as part of our mission, the Pope and Vatican have said all Catholic institutions have to divest, and BC hasn't. And so again, we didn't go this specific route. We mentioned it in our complaint, but like you said, more of like the greenwashing and essentially false advertising. That is another type of complaint that you can do with an attorney general, and even federally, similar to the case against Chevron. Just in the sense that again, for us, BC is saying, we're Catholic, which means we align with the Pope, and then they explicitly aren't aligning with the Pope. And that's its own set of arguments, and you could make the same case with like statements your school and BlackRock have made, about caring about the environment and saying that they divest and ultimately not doing that. And that's a matter of now it could devalue your degree, or affect prospective students, and how you were kind of enticed to go to that school is now different from their actual actions. So again, there's kind of like that fraud, false advertising, greenwashing can be its own thing, or it can just be part of that narrative with the specific financial case as well. So there's a lot of different routes there.
One more thing I'll just add, because someone asked me this in a private chat, but I think it's useful for everyone. How did, and maybe Kyle has an answer too, and Martha can add, how did you determine that filing a complaint was the right decision for your campaign specifically? Like, we decided fossil fuel divest Harvard because we knew we weren't going to go. It's never been a question of like persuading our like very elite moneyed fossil fuel interest captured institution that divestment is what they should do. Like, that's very clear. And so like we decided, because we are effectively running a public pressure campaign. And I will say, like, in terms of retribution, like there are consequences. For example, we were in probably the best per se mode of communication that we'd ever been in with like Harvard's governance, which is not that good, to be clear. Again, we never rely on meetings with them to think like we're going to persuade them to divest. But like, it is true, we have worked hard to establish open communication channels, and we actually were in a process of like having a follow-up meeting for the first time ever with like the chairman of the Corporation Committee on Shareholder Responsibility, after having met with the whole committee. And that's the group that like makes the decisions about divestment. And then as soon as this complaint happened, they like were like, JK, we're not talking to you anymore. And there's no legal reason for them to do that, to be clear. Like, we're not in litigation with them. If any litigation emerges from the complaint, we won't be party to it. So it's not like they can be like, we're not, that was what they said, but that's just not true. Like, that they're not supposed to talk to us for legal reasons. They were just pissed at us because we did something that set them off. For us, like, we decided ultimately that was a risk we were worth taking, because like, it doesn't matter, because we're not ever going to get to them through dialogue. So like, happy as we are to be there for open dialogue, much as our campaign is genuinely committed to that as a core principle, it's not our strategy to try to talk to them. And we ultimately feel like we've made the case pretty clear to them for like a decade that divestment is what they should be doing, and they're still not doing it. So that's how we decided.
Yeah, and I'll say it's very similar to our case at Boston College. Our campaign it's been almost 20 years. There's been calls for socially responsible investing, and about at least 10 years of specific fossil fuel divestment. and almost no engagement, and we've left that open, dialogue similar to Harvard. But with no action on that, I would say about 2 years before we actually filed, I've been doing private research and just discussing it privately within our campaign as just an idea. And ultimately we were engaged, I would say, in the most talks we had at that point with administrators, and ultimately a series of meetings with administrators, trustees were abruptly canceled. And we had one final one, I believe it was in August of 2020. And we had a meeting where I was point blank told by an administrator, climate change is not and will not be a priority of this university. And, our endowment, will not be, touched by anything that students call for, really. And it was after that meeting that, we knew it, but it became, very much verbalized that this was not going to be something that they were, going to even engage in the idea of. And so as soon as that meeting ended, was when the work formally began on writing and filing the complaint. And again, even though it is with the Attorney General, I'd say our campaign is still very open to dialogue and wants to engage on this issue. And we hope that our school would act on it before the Attorney General compels them to, because we don't want to see that kind of action. We want to see the university do it on its own accord. But that's how we really got to the point, is where it was just, we were kind of explicitly told, you have to find another way to get this done. And so we did.
All right, I think we're at time, but if you look at the slides, there's contact information for all three of us and for the Climate Defense Project, and lots of links and resources. So yeah, please don't hesitate to reach out. It would be so wonderful if other people filed complaints, because it's great on like an individual institution level, but I think it also just helps the broader divestment movement. And I think could be really powerful if people, like more schools in Massachusetts, across the country. Yeah, I think that would be really wonderful. All right, yeah. Any other closing thoughts, Alana or Kyle?
I just say, oh, go ahead. I would say, yeah, like link up. I mean, I know a lot of people in the divestment movement are linked up with schools in their city or state. And I mean, I've been very helpful, this relationship between BC and Harvard campaigns. Again, we both have complaints with the Attorney General that just puts more pressure on her office to act and on our own schools. And so, if anyone is interested in this, I would say reach out to other schools that, might be interested in your state, because that would really, help the press, the narrative, the pressure on the Attorney General, all of that. And again, we're happy to probably talk about that much further. So definitely reach out about anything. We're happy to talk.
Yeah, I just second that. And I say, like, this is definitely a really helpful thing. Like, already we've had other schools reach out to us, like, about writing complaints, which is super exciting to see. And the only reason, like, we did it is because we reached out to Boston College about writing one. So, like, cycle continues. But we're all very happy personally to be resources for you guys as well.
Awesome. Thanks so much for joining, everyone.
Thanks, guys.